You're lying in bed, scrolling through your phone one last time before sleep. The house is quiet. Your family is asleep down the hall. Then you hear it, your own voice whispering from somewhere inside the walls. Don't fall asleep. Please don't fall asleep. You freeze. The voice comes again, more desperate this time. If you fall asleep, I can't wake up. Your phone screen flickers, showing your reflection, but in it, your eyes are wide with terror, and your mouth is moving, pleading with someone you can't see. The whispers grow louder. It's definitely your voice, but you're not speaking. Like and subscribe if you want to know what happens when you finally close your eyes. Sarah Chun had always dreamed of owning a cabin in the woods, but not like this. Not through the death of a great aunt she'd never met. And certainly not one that came with a letter so cryptic it made her hand shake as she read it for the third time. Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm finally free. The cabin is yours now, along with everything in it. I pray you're stronger than I was. The woods remember everything. Child, everything. Aunt Millicent, the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, had been equally unsettling. His weathered face carried the kind of lines that spoke of sleepless nights. And when he handed her the keys, his fingers lingered on hers for just a moment too long. Miss Chun, he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. Your aunt, she was a good woman, but that place changed her. If you're smart, you'll sell it without ever setting foot inside. But Sarah wasn't smart, apparently. She was desperate. The divorce had left her with nothing but debt and a broken heart. Her job at the marketing firm barely covered her cramped apartment rent, and the idea of a free cabin, even one shrouded in family mystery, felt like a lifeline. The drive to Whispering Pines took 3 hours through winding mountain roads that seemed to close in around her Honda Civic like gnarled fingers. The GPS had lost signal 40 minutes ago, leaving her to navigate by the hand-drawn map Mr. Henderson had reluctantly provided. As she rounded the final bend, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The cabin wasn't the rustic retreat she'd imagined. It was a sprawling 2-story structure of dark wood and stone, with windows that reflected the late afternoon sun like watching eyes. Pine trees towered around it, their branches swaying in a wind she couldn't feel from inside her car. But it was beautiful in its own haunting way. The wraparound porch beckoned with its promise of quiet mornings and coffee at sunrise. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something other than despair. She felt hope. She parked beside a well-maintained garden where wildflowers bloomed in impossible abundance for late October. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her nose wrinkle. The front door was heavy oak, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The key turned easily, too easily, as if the lock had been waiting for her. Inside, the cabin was a study in contradictions. The furniture was expensive but old-fashioned, the kind of pieces you'd find in a museum. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and bookshelves lined every wall, filled with volumes that looked like they'd been bound by hand. But there was something wrong with the shadows. They fell at odd angles and seemed to move independently of their sources. Sarah set her suitcase down and explored room by room. The kitchen was modern enough, with a gas stove and a refrigerator that hummed contentedly. The living room centered around a massive stone fireplace, above which hung a portrait of a woman with Sarah's own dark eyes and angular features. Aunt Millicent, she assumed, though something about the woman's expression made her look away quickly. Upstairs, she found 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that looked original to the house. The master bedroom faced east, with windows that would catch the morning sun. Sarah claimed it immediately, though she noticed the locks on the windows were on the inside, not to keep people out, but to keep something in. As she unpacked, Sarah tried to ignore the sounds coming from the walls. Old houses settled, she told herself. The creaking and whispers were just the wood adjusting to temperature changes. The fact that the sound seemed to follow her from room to room was pure coincidence. By evening, she'd made the cabin livable. She'd found linens in a cedar chest, along with a collection of quilts that smelled of lavender and something else she couldn't identify. The refrigerator was stocked with basics. Someone had been maintaining the place, though Mr. Henderson hadn't mentioned the caretaker. Sarah made herself a simple dinner of pasta and sauce. eating at the kitchen table, while rain began to patter against the windows. The sound was soothing at first, but as darkness fell, it seemed to take on an almost rhythmic quality, like Morse code tapped out by ghostly fingers. She was washing dishes when she heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling her name from somewhere deep in the house. "Hello?" she called back, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. "Is someone there?" The only response was the rain against the windows and the settling of old wood. Sarah dried her hands slowly, her heart rate climbing. She'd locked the front door, hadn't she? She was almost certain she had. A quick check confirmed it. The door was locked, the window secure. She was alone in the cabin, alone with the rain and the whispering walls and the growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake. But where could she go? Her apartment lease was up, her belongings were in storage, and she had exactly $847 in her checking account. Like it or not, the cabin was her home now. Sarah made herself a cup of tea and settled into the living room with one of Aunt Millicent's books, a collection of local folklore that felt appropriate for a stormy night. She was reading about the indigenous peoples who'd once lived in these mountains when the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, pressing against her like a living thing. Sarah fumbled for her phone's flashlight, and in its pale glow, she saw that she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, indistinct, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, she and the figure regarded each other in silence. Then her phone's battery died, plunging her back into darkness. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. The only answer was a sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling her in the dark. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the chair, paralyzed by fear and the growing realization that whatever was in the room with her wasn't human. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her chair. Sarah could feel a presence looming over her, could smell that sweet, cloying scent she'd noticed earlier. It was the smell of flowers left too long in water, of beauty turned to decay. "Sarah." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome home." The lights flickered back on as suddenly as they'd gone out. Sarah found herself alone in the living room, the book still open on her lap, her cold cup of tea sitting innocently on the side table. But the portrait above the fireplace had changed. Aunt Millicent's eyes now seemed to be looking directly at her, and her mouth was curved in what might have been a smile or a warning. Sarah spent the rest of the night huddled in the master bedroom, a chair propped against the door and every light in the room blazing. She dozed fitfully, waking at every sound, every creak of the old house settling around her. In the gray light of dawn, her fears seemed foolish, the product of an overactive imagination and too much stress. But when she went downstairs to make coffee, she found muddy footprints on the kitchen floor, footprints that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They led from the back door to the living room and back again, as if someone had been pacing, watching, waiting. Sarah made her coffee with shaking hands and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the evidence of her midnight visitor. The logical part of her mind offered explanations, a vagrant seeking shelter, a neighbor checking on the property, her own sleepwalking brought on by stress. But deep down, she knew the truth was far more sinister. She was not alone in the cabin. She might never be alone again. Chapter 2. The Neighbors. The knock on the door came at exactly 9 a.m. 3 sharp raps that made Sarah's coffee cup rattle against the saucer. She'd been awake for hours, watching the sunrise paint the pine trees in shades of gold and red, trying to convince herself that the previous night had been a stress-induced nightmare. Through the peephole, she saw a woman about her own age standing on the porch, holding a covered dish and wearing the kind of warm smile that belonged in a small-town commercial. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore a yellow sundress that made her look like a ray of sunshine against the dark of the porch. "Hi there," the woman said when Sarah opened the door. "I'm Emma Walsh. I live just down the road. I brought you a casserole. Figured you might be too busy settling in to cook." Sarah felt a wave of relief, so intense it made her knees weak. A normal person, a neighbor with a casserole. Maybe she wasn't going insane after all. "That's incredibly kind of you," Sarah said, accepting the warm dish. I'm Sarah Chun. Please, come in. Emma stepped inside and immediately began exclaiming over the cabin's features. The exposed beams, the stone fireplace, the beautiful hardwood floors. But Sarah noticed that her eyes kept darting to the shadows, and she stayed close to the windows, as if ready to flee at a moment's notice. This place has such history, Emma said, running her hand along the mantelpiece. Your aunt was a remarkable woman. She'd lived here for, 60 years? Something like that, Sarah replied, though she realized she knew almost nothing about Aunt Millicent's life. Did you know her well? Emma's cheerful expression faltered slightly. As well as anyone could, I suppose. She was very private, especially in her later years. We tried to check on her, but she wouldn't let anyone inside. Said the house didn't like strangers. The house didn't like strangers? Sarah repeated, fighting back a nervous laugh. Oh, you know how it is with old folks, Emma said quickly. They get set in their ways. I'm sure she was just being protective of her privacy. But her eyes said something different, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. They sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, and Emma filled Sarah in on the local area. The nearest town was Pine Ridge, population 847, about a 15-minute drive down the mountain. There was a grocery store, a diner, a gas station, and not much else. Most of the surrounding area was national forest, with only a handful of year-round residents scattered through the mountains. Gets pretty quiet up here, especially in winter, Emma said, but it's peaceful, good for thinking, writing, that sort of thing. What brings you to our little corner of the world? Sarah found herself opening up to Emma in a way she hadn't with anyone since the divorce. She talked about her failed marriage, her dead-end job, the inheritance that felt like either a blessing or a curse. Emma listened with the kind of attention that made Sarah feel heard, understood, less alone. A fresh start, Emma said when Sarah finished. I think that's wonderful and brave. Not everyone would be willing to take on a place like this. What do you mean, a place like this? Emma set down her coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. Old houses have their own personalities, don't you think? They hold on to things, memories, emotions, experiences. Sometimes that can be overwhelming, especially when you're already dealing with a lot of change. Sarah wanted to ask more, but something in Emma's expression warned her off. Instead, she changed the subject to practical matters: where to shop for groceries, which repair services were reliable, how to prepare for the approaching winter. Emma stayed for an hour, and when she left, Sarah felt more optimistic than she had in months. She had a neighbor, a potential friend, someone who could help her navigate this new chapter of her life. The morning sunlight had chased away the shadows that had seemed so menacing the night before. But as she watched Emma's car disappear down the winding road, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The woman's muddy footprints on the porch were the same size and shape as the ones she'd found in her kitchen that morning. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Emma had mentioned checking on Aunt Millicent. Maybe she'd been in the habit of letting herself in, had a key, had come by the night before, without realizing Sarah was already there. But why hadn't Emma mentioned it? And how had she gotten inside when Sarah was certain she'd locked the door? The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Sarah drove to Pine Ridge and stocked up on supplies. Tried to ignore the way conversation stopped when she entered the grocery store. The way people stared at her were a mixture of curiosity and something that looked like pity. The store clerk, a teenage girl with purple streaks in her hair, was more forthcoming than the other customers. "You're staying up at the old Millicent place," she said, not really asking. "That's brave." Brave. Sarah signed a receipt and waited for an explanation. The girl glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "My grandmother always said the house was cursed. Said the woods around it were wrong somehow. Animals won't go near it. Birds won't nest in the trees." "That's ridiculous," Sarah said. But even as she spoke, she realized she hadn't seen a single bird or squirrel around the cabin. "Maybe," the girl said with a shrug. "But I wouldn't stay there alone if you paid me. Not after what happened to your aunt." "What happened to my aunt?" "She died screaming," the girl said matter-of-factly. My dad, a volunteer EMT. He was on the call. Said he never heard anything like it, like she was being torn apart from the inside. Sarah left the store with her hands shaking and her mind reeling. She'd been told Aunt Millicent had died peacefully in her sleep. Natural causes. Nothing traumatic or unusual. But why would the girl lie? And why would Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, have lied to her? The drive back to the cabin felt longer than usual. The pine trees pressing closer to the road, their branches scraping against her car like grasping fingers. By the time she reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked uncomfortably like blood. Sarah carried her groceries inside and began putting them away, trying to shake off the day's unsettling encounters. She was being paranoid, she told herself. Small towns were full of gossip and superstition. The clerk's story was probably just local folklore, grown more dramatic with each telling. But as she reached for the cabinet above the refrigerator, her fingers brushed against something that made her freeze. There, taped to the inside of the cabinet door, was an envelope with her name written in spidery handwriting. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it and read, "Sarah, if you're reading this, then you survived your first night. Good. That means you're stronger than I hoped. But strength won't be enough for what's coming. The thing in the woods has been waiting for someone like you, someone with a gift. It fed on me for 60 years, but I was already old when it claimed me. You're young, vital. It will want to keep you for much longer. There are rules, child. Learn them. Follow them. Your life depends on it. Aunt Millicent." Below the letter was a list, written in the same shaky handwriting. Rules for surviving the whispering pines. 1. Never go into the woods alone after dark. 2. Salt the doorways and windows every 3 days. 3. Never trust your own reflection after midnight. 4. If you hear voices calling your name, don't answer. 5. The mirrors in the bathroom know things. Listen to them. 6. Feed it on the new moon or it will feed on you. 7. Never, ever let it know that you can see it. Sarah read the list 3 times, each reading making her feel more sick to her stomach. This had to be some kind of cruel joke, a product of her aunt's deteriorating mental state. People didn't really believe in monsters and curses and supernatural entities. But even as she tried to dismiss the letter, she found herself looking around the kitchen for salt, and she noticed, for the first time, that every window and door in the cabin was already lined with a thin white powder that she'd assumed was cleaning residue. As if summoned by her thoughts, the lights began to flicker, not the steady dimming of a power outage, but a rhythmic pulsing that seemed almost like a heartbeat. Sarah grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and headed for the basement to check the electrical panel. The basement was unfinished, with stone walls and a dirt floor that smelled of earth and something else, something organic and rotting. The electrical panel was modern, professionally installed, with no obvious problems. But as Sarah played her flashlight beam around the room, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. The walls were covered in symbols, carved deep into the stone, painted in what looked like dried blood, scratched by fingernails or claws. Some were recognizable as religious symbols from various traditions. Others looked like ancient runes, and still others were geometrical patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the center of the far wall, carved deeper than all the rest, was a message in English. "IT knows you're here." Sarah backed toward the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The beam of her flashlight seemed to be growing dimmer, as if the darkness was actively fighting against it. She could hear something moving in the shadows, a slithering, scraping sound that might have been fabric dragging across stone, or something much worse. She made it to the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door behind her, turning the deadbolt with shaking hands. Only then did she realize that deadbolts were designed to keep things out, not in. Why would someone install a deadbolt on the inside of a basement door? The lights in the kitchen had stopped flickering, but they seemed dimmer now, as if the bulbs were dying. Sarah went through the cabin systematically, turning on every light, checking every lock, drawing every curtain. She found salt in the pantry and began pouring along the windowsills and doorways, following the faint traces of the old lines. As she worked, she could feel eyes watching her from the darkness outside. Not human eyes, something older, hungrier, more patient. She tried to ignore the sensation, focusing on the simple, repetitive task of laying down salt barriers. But when she reached the living room, she found that the portrait above the fireplace had changed again. Aunt Millicent's expression was no longer neutral. Now she looked terrified, her painted eyes wide with fear and her mouth open in a silent scream. Sarah stared at the painting, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Paintings didn't change. It was impossible. But the image was undeniably different from what she'd seen the night before. A sound from the kitchen made her spin around. The soft whisper of the back door opening. Sarah crept toward the kitchen, her hands gripping the salt container like a weapon. The door stood ajar, revealing a slice of darkness that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" The darkness answered with sound like wind through dead leaves, like whispers in a language that predated human speech. Sarah slammed the door shut and poured salt along its base, backing away as something on the other side began to scratch at the wood. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, accompanied by soft sound that might have been crying or might have been laughter. Sarah huddled in the living room, watching the doors and windows, waiting for dawn and hoping she'd live to see it. When the first pale light of morning finally crept through the curtains, the scratching stopped. Sarah cautiously approached the back door and peered through the window. The porch was empty, but the door itself was scored with deep gouges that definitely hadn't been there the night before. She made coffee with shaking hands and sat at the kitchen table, staring at Aunt Millicent's letter and trying to make sense of her situation. Either she was losing her mind, or she was trapped in a cabin with something that defied rational explanation. But as she read through the rules again, one thing became clear. If she wanted to survive, she had to play by the creature's rules. And the first rule was simple enough. Never go into the woods alone after dark. The problem was, she had no idea what the other rules meant. What was she supposed to feed it? What did the mirrors know? And how could she avoid letting it know she could see it when it was obviously making no effort to hide from her? Sarah finished her coffee and made a decision. She needed help, and the only person who might have answers was Emma Walsh. Emma had known Aunt Millicent, had lived in the area for years, and had seemed to understand more about the cabin than she let on. But first, she needed to understand what she was dealing with. Sarah spent the morning going through Aunt Millicent's books, looking for anything that might explain the symbols in the basement, the rules in the letter, or the thing that was stalking her. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. Chapter 3, The Research. Aunt Millicent's library was extensive and eclectic, covering everything from local history to quantum physics. But Sarah found herself drawn to a particular section that seemed to call to her. The books here were older, bound in leather that felt somehow alive under her fingers. Their titles were written in languages she didn't recognize, though somehow she understood their meaning. Entities of the northern forests, feeding rituals of the old growth. The Watchers in the Woods. Each book felt heavier than it should, as if the words themselves carried weight. Sarah settled into Aunt Millicent's reading chair, a wing-backed monstrosity that seemed to embrace whoever sat in it, and began to read. The first book was a collection of accounts from early settlers, translated from various European languages. The stories were remarkably consistent. Something lived in the deep woods, something that fed on human emotion and life force, something that had been there long before the first humans arrived. The Native American tribes had known about it. According to the book, they called it the Hollow One, the hunger that walks, the shadow between trees. They'd made offerings to it, respected its territory, and in return, it had largely left them alone. But the European settlers had no such understanding. They'd built their homes wherever they pleased, cut down ancient trees, and disturbed sacred spaces. The entity had responded with a campaign of terror that lasted for generations. Entire families would disappear overnight, leaving behind only empty homes and a lingering scent of decay. Children would be found wandering the woods, their eyes blank and their memories gone. Adults would age decades in the span of weeks, their life force slowly drain away. But the most chilling accounts were from those who'd survived encounters with the entity. They described a presence that could take any form, appear as loved ones or trusted friends, mimic voices and faces with perfect accuracy. It fed on fear, loneliness, and despair, but preferred to take its time to establish a relationship with its victims before slowly consuming them. Sarah's hands were shaking as she read, but she forced herself to continue. The book described the entity's feeding patterns, its preferences, its weaknesses. Salt was mentioned frequently, as were iron, running water, and mirrors. The entity was bound by certain rules, ancient laws that it couldn't break even if it wanted to. But the most important information was in the final chapter: how to appease it. According to the book, the entity required regular offerings, not food or money, but of memory and emotion. Happy memories. Specifically, the victim would perform a ritual on each new moon, surrendering their most treasured recollections to the entity. In return, it would leave them alone for another month. The ritual was described in detail, along with dire warnings about what would happen if the offerings were missed or deemed insufficient. The entity would begin to feed directly, starting with the victim's sanity and working its way through their life force until nothing remained but an empty shell. Sarah closed the book and sat in silence, processing what she'd read. The rational part of her mind rebelled against the information, insisting that it was all folklore and superstition. But the scratches on her door and the footprints in her kitchen suggested otherwise. She was reaching for another book when she heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, she saw Emma Walsh climbing the porch steps, carrying what looked like a homemade pie. Sarah opened the door before Emma could knock, grateful for the interruption. "Emma, what a nice surprise." "I was in the neighborhood," Emma said, though they both knew there was no real neighborhood to speak of. "Thought you might like some apple pie. How are you settling in?" "Fine," Sarah lied, accepting the pie. "Just doing some reading." Emma's eyes darted to the books scattered around the reading chair, and her expression changed. "Oh, you found Millicent's collection. You know about these books?" Emma stepped inside without being invited, moving carefully as if the floor might give way beneath her feet. Millicent was always interested in local history. She said it was important to understand the area, to know what came before. "Emma," Sarah said, closing the door behind her, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there something wrong with this place? Something dangerous?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the portrait above the fireplace. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What have you experienced?" Sarah told her everything: the voices, the footprints, the figure in the darkness, the basement symbols, the changing portrait. Emma listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each detail. "Show me the basement," Emma said when Sarah finished. They descended the stairs together, Emma carrying a flashlight that seemed to cut through the darkness more effectively than Sarah's had. The symbols were still there, carved and painted and scratched into the stone, but they seemed less menacing in Emma's presence. "These are protection symbols," Emma said, running her fingers along the carved lines. Millicent was trying to keep something out, or in. "The books mention an entity," Sarah said. "Something that lives in the woods, something that feeds on people." Emma turned to face her, and Sarah saw her own fear reflected in the other woman's eyes. "Sarah, I should have told you yesterday. I should have warned you, but I was hoping it would leave you alone. You know what it is? I know what it did to your aunt, and to the people who lived here before her, and before them." Emma's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "My family has been in these mountains for 5 generations. We've always known about the thing in the woods. We've always known to stay away from this place. Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me, and because..." Emma hesitated. "Because I thought maybe you could handle it." Millicent lasted 60 years. She was strong, stubborn, clever. She learned to live with it, to feed it what it wanted without letting it completely destroy her. "The offerings," Sarah said. "Happy memories." Emma nodded. Once a month, on the new moon, she performed the ritual, give it her most precious recollections, and it would leave her alone for another month. But toward the end, she was running out of good memories. The entity was getting stronger, hungrier. It wanted more than she could give. What happened to her? She tried to fight it, broke the pattern, refused to make the offering. The entity, it didn't take kindly to that. It fed on her directly, consumed her life force in one night. The screaming, Emma shuddered. The whole mountain heard it. Sarah felt sick, and now it wants me. Yes, but you're young, Sarah. You have a lifetime of memories to offer. If you're careful, if you follow the rules, you could live here for decades. Live here as what? A prisoner? A slave to some monster? Emma's expression was sympathetic, but firm. It's better than the alternative. The entity doesn't just kill, Sarah. It erases you, your memories, your experiences, your very existence. People who anger it don't just die, they're forgotten, as if they never existed at all. Sarah thought about the empty feeling she'd had when she'd first arrived, the sense that something was missing from her life. The divorce, she said suddenly. My ex-husband. I can barely remember him. Not his face, not his voice, not how we met. Emma's face went white. Sarah, how long have you been having memory problems? Since I moved here, but I thought it was just stress. It's already started feeding on you. Emma grabbed her arm. We need to perform the ritual tonight. The new moon isn't for another week, but we can't wait. They spent the afternoon preparing. Emma knew the ritual by heart, had learned it from her grandmother, who'd learned it from her grandmother before her. It was a family tradition, she explained, a way of staying safe in a dangerous world. The ritual required several components. White candles arranged in a specific pattern, salt mixed with herbs from the garden, a mirror to serve as a focal point, and most importantly, a memory of perfect happiness. It has to be real, Emma warned as they arranged the candles in the basement. The entity can sense fake emotions. You need to choose something genuine, something that brings you true joy. Sarah thought about her life, searching for moments of pure happiness. Her wedding day was tainted by the knowledge of how it had ended. Her college graduation felt hollow. Her childhood was so far away it seemed like someone else's life. But then she remembered her 16th birthday, when her parents had surprised her with a trip to the beach. She'd stood in the ocean at sunset, feeling the waves wash over her feet, and for one perfect moment, she felt completely at peace with the world. The memory was so vivid she could taste the salt spray and feel the warm sand between her toes. I have it, she said. Emma nodded and began to light the candles. The basement filled with flickering shadows that danced along the symbol-covered walls. The mirror they placed in the center of the circle reflected the flames. But as Sarah watched, other images began to appear in its surface. She saw the woods surrounding the cabin, but not as they were now. These were older trees, ancient giants that had stood for centuries. And moving between them was a figure that defied description, sometimes tall and thin, sometimes short and broad, sometimes barely human at all. Its only constant feature was its eyes, which reflected the candlelight like a predator's. It's here, Emma whispered. Begin the offering. Sarah closed her eyes and reached for the memory of her 16th birthday. She held in her mind, reliving every detail. The warmth of the sun, the sound of the waves, the feeling of infinite possibility that had filled her heart. Then, slowly, she began to let it go. The memory unraveled like a tapestry being unwoven. First the details faded, the color of the sky, the feel of the sand. Then the emotions dimmed, the joy, the peace, the sense of belonging. Finally, the core of the memory dissolved, leaving behind only the knowledge that something had once happened on her 16th birthday, something important that she could no longer recall. The mirror went dark, and the candles flickered out simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, Sarah heard something like a sigh of satisfaction, and then silence. Emma relit their flashlights, and they climbed back upstairs in silence. The cabin felt different now. Not welcoming, exactly, but not actively hostile either. The shadows had retreated to their proper places, and the portrait above the fireplace had returned to its original neutral expression. It's done, Emma said. You should be safe for another month. And then you do it again, and again, for as long as you want to live here. Sarah made them both coffee, and they sat in the kitchen discussing practicalities of her new reality. Emma gave her advice on which memories to sacrifice first. Childhood moments were often the easiest to part with. How to stretch her offerings when she was running low on happiness, And what signs to watch for that might indicate the entity was growing impatient? What about the other rules? Sarah asked. The mirrors knowing things, not trusting my reflection. The mirrors are connected to the entity, Emma explained. They can show you things, warnings, glimpses of the future, information about the entity's plans. But after midnight, they can also lie, show you false images designed to drive you mad. And your reflection, sometimes it's not really yours. What do you mean? Emma hesitated. The entity can inhabit reflections, use them to communicate or spy. If you see your reflection doing something you're not doing, or if it speaks to you, don't respond. Don't even acknowledge that you've seen it. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Has it ever tried to take over? Possess someone? Not exactly. But it can influence people, make them do things they wouldn't normally do. That's why the rules exist, to limit its power, to keep it contained. They talked until well past midnight. Emma sharing stories passed down through her family. Sarah asking questions about her new reality. By the time Emma left, Sarah felt she had a better understanding of her situation, though she wouldn't have called it hopeful. She was a prisoner, bound to this place by circumstances and necessity. But she was a living prisoner, which was better than the alternative. She could learn to live with the entity, to manage its demands, to carve out some semblance of a normal life within constraints of her supernatural situation. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the bathroom mirror. For just a moment, her reflection seemed to smile at her, a cold, knowing smile that didn't match her own expression. Then it was gone, and she was looking at her own tired face again. She turned away from the mirror and went to bed, trying not to think about the fact that she just traded away one of her happiest memories for another month of survival. As she drifted off to sleep, she could have sworn she heard the entity's voice whispering through the walls. Thank you for the gift, Sarah. It was delicious. 3 weeks passed in a strange semblance of normalcy. Sarah established a routine that helped her feel more in control of her situation. She woke each morning at sunrise, made coffee, and spent the early hours reading or working on her laptop. She'd started freelance writing, crafting articles about travel and lifestyle for online magazines. Ironic, given her current circumstances. The entity kept its distance during these daylight hours, though she could always sense its presence in the shadows between the trees. Sometimes she'd catch glimpses of it from the corner of her eye, a tall figure standing just inside the tree line, watching the cabin with patient hunger. Emma visited twice a week, bringing news from town and supplies Sarah couldn't get delivered to the remote location. Their friendship had deepened through shared knowledge of the supernatural situation, though Sarah noticed that Emma was careful never to stay past sunset. It's not that I don't trust you, Emma explained one afternoon as she prepared to leave. It's that the entity gets stronger at night, more unpredictable. I don't want to be here if it decides to test the boundaries. Sarah understood. She'd learned to read the signs that indicated the entity's mood. The way shadows moved independently of their sources, the temperature drops that had nothing to do with weather, the subtle changes in the sounds of the forest. The entity was like a predator stalking its prey, patient but always present. The mirrors had become her primary source of information about the entity's activities. During the day, they showed her useful things, weather patterns, the locations of deer and other animals, even glimpses of Emma's daily routine. But as Emma had warned, they became unreliable after midnight. Sarah learned this lesson the hard way one night, when she'd gotten up for a glass of water. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror had looked normal at first, but as she'd watched, it had begun to age rapidly. Years passed in seconds, her hair turning gray, her face wrinkling, her eyes growing dim. The reflection had smiled at her with rotten teeth and whispered, "This is what I'll do to you if you stop feeding me." She covered every mirror in the house after that, only uncovering them during safe daylight hours. The basement had become her sanctuary, strange as it seemed. The protection symbols carved into the walls seemed to limit the entity's influence, making it one of the few places in the cabin where she felt truly safe. She'd moved some of Aunt Millicent's books down there, creating a small library where she could research without feeling watched. It was in the basement that she made her most disturbing discovery. Sarah had been reading about the entity's history when she'd found a loose stone in the wall. Behind it was a small cavity containing a leather journal. its pages filled with Aunt Millicent's handwriting. The entries span decades, chronicling her relationship with the entity in painful detail. The early entries were almost businesslike, recording the dates of offerings and the entity's responses. But as the years passed, the tone grew more desperate, more personal. Millicent had begun to think of the entity as a companion, the only constant in her isolated life. It spoke to me today, really spoke, not just whispers and threats. Its voice was almost gentle. It said I was the best host it had ever had, that I understood its needs better than anyone before me. I felt proud. How twisted is that? I felt proud that a monster approved of me. I dream about it now. Not nightmares. Dreams where we walk to the forest together, where it shows me things no human was meant to see. Beautiful things. Terrible things. I wake up feeling like I betrayed myself, but I look forward to sleeping again. The loneliness is the worst part. Not the offerings, not the fear, but the absolute isolation. It's been 3 months since I've spoken to another human being. The entity is my only company now, and I find myself talking to it, sharing my thoughts and fears. It listens. It actually listens. I understand now why the previous owners went mad. It's not just a feeding, it's a relationship. The entity doesn't just want your memories. It wants your soul. It wants to be the most important thing in your life, the center of your existence. And the horrible thing is, after enough years, it becomes exactly that. The final entries were the most disturbing. Millicent had begun to express affection for the entity, to worry about its well-being, to take pride in the quality of her offerings. She'd written about the entity as if it were a beloved but demanding pet, something that needed care and attention. I gave her my wedding day today. Harold's face when he saw me in my dress. I'd held on to that memory for 43 years, but it was getting lonely sitting in my mind all by itself. The entity seemed to enjoy it more than usual. I think it likes memories that involve love. It makes me wonder if it's capable of love itself, or if it simply enjoys the taste of the emotion. I'm running out of good memories. The entity is getting impatient with my offerings. Last month I tried to give a memory of reading a good book, but it rejected it, said it was too small, too insignificant. It wants the big moments now. Births, deaths, first loves, major achievements. But I've already given it most of those. What happens when there's nothing left? It showed me its true form today. Not the shadows and half glimpses I'm used to, but its real appearance. I can't describe it in words. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's been blind from birth. But it was beautiful in its own way. Terrible and beautiful and absolutely alien. I wept when it changed back to its usual form. I think I'm losing my mind. The journal's final entry was dated just a week before Millicent's death. I can't do this anymore. The entity owns me now, owns my thoughts and dreams and memories. I am nothing but a vessel for its hunger. I've decided to stop the offerings, to let it kill me rather than continue this half-life. If someone finds this journal, if someone else inherits this house, tell them. Don't try to fight it, but don't let it consume you either. Find a middle path, a way to coexist without losing yourself. I pray I was simply too weak, too isolated, too desperate for companionship. Maybe you'll be stronger. Sarah closed the journal with shaking hands. She understood now why Emma had seemed so reluctant to discuss the entity's true nature. It wasn't just a monster that demanded tribute. It was a parasite that slowly consumed its host's identity, replacing human relationships with its own twisted form of companionship. The thought terrified her more than any physical threat could have. She'd already been isolated by her divorce, cut off from friends and family by shame and circumstance. How long before she started looking forward to the entity's attention? How long before she began to think of it as a friend rather than a captor? That night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't just survive the entity's demands. She would find a way to break free from them entirely. There had to be a way to escape, to sever the connection between herself and the creature in the woods. She spent the next few days researching obsessively, reading every book in Aunt Millicent's collection, looking for any mention of people who'd successfully freed themselves from the entity's influence. Most of the accounts ended in death or madness, but there were a few exceptions. One story, recorded by a traveling priest in the 1800s, told of a woman who'd managed to transfer the entity's attention to someone else. She performed a ritual that bound the creature to her husband instead, allowing her to escape while he took her place as its host. The moral implications were horrifying, but the technique was fascinating. Another account described a man who'd used mirrors to confuse the entity, creating a feedback loop that had temporarily disrupted its feeding pattern. He'd used the distraction to flee the area, though the story didn't mention whether he'd stayed free or the entity had eventually tracked him down. But the most promising lead came from a collection of Native American oral histories. The original inhabitants of the area had known about the entity for generations, and they developed methods for dealing with it that didn't involve feeding it memories. According to the stories, the entity was bound to a specific location, a grove of ancient trees deep in the forest where it first entered the world. If the grove could be found and its center disrupted, the entity would be banished back to whatever realm it had come from. The catch was that the grove was protected by the entity's power, hidden from view and surrounded by psychological barriers that drove away intruders. Those who tried to find it reported becoming lost within minutes, experiencing overwhelming fear and confusion that forced them to flee. But the stories also mentioned that the entity was weaker during certain times. Specifically, during the week following each offering, the act of feeding made it sluggish, less aware of its surroundings. It might be possible to find the grove during this vulnerable period. Sarah had just made her monthly offering 3 days ago. If the stories were accurate, she had maybe 4 more days before the entity returned to full strength. It wasn't much time, but it might be enough. She spent the next day preparing. She gathered supplies, water, food, a first aid kit, a compass, and most importantly, iron nails and sulfur protection. She studied topographical maps of the area, looking for likely locations where an ancient grove might be hidden. Emma arrived for her usual visit that afternoon, bringing fresh vegetables from her garden and news from town. Sarah almost told her about her plans, but something held her back. Emma had been helpful, but she was also a local who'd lived with the entity's presence her entire life. She might not understand Sarah's desire to destroy it entirely. "You seem different today," Emma observed as they sat in the kitchen. "More energetic." "I'm feeling better," Sarah said, which was true. Having a plan, even a dangerous one, made her feel more in control. "I think I'm adapting to life here." Emma's smile seemed forced. "That's good. Adaptation is important." Millicent took years to find her rhythm. "Emma, can I ask you something? Has anyone ever tried to find the entity's source? The place where it originally came from?" Emma's expression grew guarded. "Why would you ask that?" "Just curiosity. I've been reading about the area's history, and some of the stories mention a sacred grove." "Sarah, stop." Emma's voice was sharp. "Those stories are dangerous. The entity doesn't like people poking around its origins. Promise me you won't go looking for things that should stay lost." The vehemence in Emma's voice only strengthened Sarah's resolve. "Of course," she lied. "I was just curious about the folklore." Emma stayed for another hour, but the conversation felt strained. When she left, Sarah noticed that she locked her car doors immediately and drove away faster than usual. That evening, Sarah made her final preparations. She programmed her laptop to send an email to Emma in 24 hours, explaining what she'd attempted and providing details about the ritual in case something went wrong. She gathered her supplies and studied the maps one last time. The grove was supposedly located in the deepest part of the forest, where the oldest trees grew. Sarah had identified 3 possible locations based on topography and the historical accounts. She'd start with the most promising and work her way through the others if necessary. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. Her reflection looked back with determined eyes, and for once, she didn't feel afraid of what she might see. Tomorrow, she would either free herself from the entity's influence or die trying. Either way, she would no longer be its prisoner. Chapter 5. Into the Woods. Sarah woke before dawn, her body tense with anticipation and fear. She'd barely slept, her dreams filled with images of ancient trees and watching eyes. The entity had been restless during the night, moving around the cabin like a caged animal, occasionally scratching at the walls or whispering her name. She dressed in layers, thermal underwear, hiking pants, a moisture-wicking shirt, and a waterproof jacket. The October air was crisp, with a hint of coming winter that made her breath visible in small puffs. She packed her backpack methodically, checking each item twice. Water bottles, energy bars, first aid supplies, compass, GPS device, headlamp, spare batteries, and most importantly, the iron nails and salt that might protect her from the entity's influence. The cabin felt different as she moved through it, as if it were holding its breath. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her with disapproval, and the shadows lingered in places where light should have dispersed them. The entity knew something was different, but Sarah hoped it didn't understand what she was planning. She left a note on the kitchen table for Emma, just in case her automated email failed to send. Emma, I've gone to find the grove. I know you'll think I'm crazy, but I can't live like this anymore. If I don't come back, burn the cabin. Don't let anyone else inherit this curse. Sarah. The back door opened onto a small porch that overlooked the forest. Sarah had avoided the woods since arriving, heeding the warnings about not going out alone after dark. But now, in the gray light of dawn, the trees looked almost welcoming. Almost. She stepped off the porch and immediately felt the entity's attention focus on her like a searchlight. The temperature dropped by at least 10 degrees, and the normal sounds of the forest, birds singing, small animals rustling through the underbrush, fell silent. Sarah forced herself to walk normally, as if she were just taking a morning stroll. The entity was still sluggish from its recent feeding, but was aware enough to be curious about her unusual behavior. She needed to get deeper into the woods before it realized what she was really doing. The first quarter mile was relatively easy. The forest floor was covered with fallen leaves that crunched softly under her feet, and the trees were spaced far enough apart that she could see clearly in all directions. But as she moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sky. The air grew thick and humid, carrying scents of decay and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded Sarah of flowers left too long in standing water. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the soft whisper of wind through the leaves. Sarah checked her compass regularly, making sure she was heading in the right direction. The first location she'd identified was roughly 2 miles northeast of the cabin, in a valley between two ridges where the oldest trees on the topographical maps were located. She'd been walking for about an hour when she realized she was being followed. It started as a feeling, the sensation of eyes watching her from the shadows between the trees. When she turned to look, she saw nothing but forest, but the feeling persisted. Then she began to hear footsteps, soft and deliberate, matching her pace perfectly. Sarah stopped walking and listened. The footsteps continued for a few more seconds before stopping as well. She waited, counting to 10, then suddenly spun around. A figure stood about 50 yards behind her, partially hidden by the trees. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark coat or cloak. As Sarah watched, it stepped sideways behind a large oak tree and disappeared. "I know you're there," Sarah called out, her voice echoing strangely in the thick air. "I know you're following me." The only response was a whisper of wind through the branches. Sarah continued walking, but now she was acutely aware of her pursuer. The entity was no longer content to simply watch from a distance. It was actively stalking her, probably trying to determine what she was planning. She needed to move faster, to reach the grove before the entity decided to intervene directly. The terrain grew more difficult as she climbed toward the ridge. The forest floor became rocky and uneven, with fallen logs and hidden roots that threatened to trip her with every step. Sarah's breathing grew labored, and she had stopped frequently to consult her compass and GPS. It was during one of these stops that she heard the voice. "Sarah." It was soft and gentle, coming from somewhere behind her. "Where are you going, Sarah?" She didn't turn around. According to the rules, she shouldn't respond to voices calling her name. But the entity was persistent. "I'm worried about you, Sarah. You're going the wrong way. You'll get lost in these woods, and I won't be able to help you." The voice was moving, circling her position. Sarah forced herself to keep walking, focusing on her compass and trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in her chest. "I can show you things, Sarah. Beautiful things. Terrible things. Things that will make you understand why I need you. Now, the voice was coming from directly in front of her. Sarah looked up to see a figure standing in her path. Not the tall, thin shape she'd seen before, but something that looked almost human. Almost. It had her ex-husband's face, but the features were slightly wrong, as if painted by someone who'd only seen him in photographs. The eyes were too bright, the smile too wide, and when it spoke, the voice was definitely not David's. Sarah, you don't need to be afraid of me. I've been alone for so long, and you're the first person in decades who could truly understand me. We could be companions. You and I could show you wonders beyond human imagination. Sarah reached into her backpack and pulled out a handful of iron nails. The figure with David's face hissed and stepped backward, its form flickering like a bad television signal. You can't run from me forever, Sarah. These woods are my domain. I know every tree, every rock, every shadow, and I know what you're looking for. Do you? Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Then you know I'm not going to stop. The figure laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You think you can destroy me? You think you can break the bonds that have held me to this place for centuries? You're just a human, Sarah. Fragile, mortal, insignificant. Maybe, Sarah replied, gripping the iron nails more tightly. But I'm also desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. The figure's expression changed, the false smile fading into something more honest and infinitely more frightening. If you continue on this path, I will make you suffer in ways you cannot imagine. I will feed on your pain, your fear, your sanity. I will keep you alive for decades, harvesting your agony like a farmer harvests grain. You're already doing that, Sarah said. What you're describing is just the same prison with different bars. The figure stared at her for a long moment, then began to fade. You have until sunset, it said as it dissolved into shadow. Find what you're looking for, or spend the rest of your very long life regretting your choice. The forest fell silent again, but Sarah knew the Endy was still watching. She could feel its attention, like a physical weight on her shoulders. She checked her GPS. She was still about a mile from the first location. She needed to move faster. The next hour was a nightmare of difficult terrain and psychological pressure. The entity didn't appear again, but its influence was everywhere. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent intent. Sarah began to hear sounds that didn't belong in the forest. Children laughing, women weeping, men screaming in agony. The sounds came from all directions, sometimes close enough that she spun around expecting to see their sources, sometimes distant enough that she wondered if she was imagining them. The worst part was the whispers. They came from the trees themselves, soft voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. They told her she was lost, that she would never find what she was looking for, that she was going to die alone in the woods with no one to remember her. Sarah forced herself to keep walking, checking her compass obsessively, marking her progress on the GPS. The first location was close now, just over the next ridge. She could make it if she didn't let the entity's psychological warfare break her concentration. But as she climbed the final slope, the voices grew louder and more insistent. They were no longer just whispers. They were shouts, screams, the sound of 1,000 tortured souls crying out in unison. Sarah pressed her hands to her ears, but the sounds were inside her head now, reverberating through her skull like a bell tower at midnight. She stumbled to the top of the ridge and looked down into the valley below. What she saw made her forget about the voices entirely. The valley was filled with trees unlike any she'd ever seen. They were massive, ancient giants that dwarfed even the largest oaks and pines in the surrounding forest. Their trunks were easily 20 feet in diameter, their branches reaching toward the sky like the arms of supplicants. But it was their color that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The trees were white, not the pale bark of birches or aspens, but a pure, luminous white that seemed to glow with its own internal light. And in the center of the grove, where the largest trees formed a natural circle, the air itself seemed to shimmer with otherworldly energy. Sarah had found the grove. Now she just had to figure out how to get to it. The slope down into the valley was steep and treacherous, covered with loose rocks and hidden roots. But the real challenge wasn't physical. It was psychological. As soon as Sarah started down the slope, the entity's influence hit her like a physical blow. Terror flooded through her system, primal and overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. Her vision blurred, her hands shook, and her legs felt like they were made of rubber. But Sarah had expected this. The stories had mentioned the psychological barriers protecting the grove. She pulled out her iron nails and salt, creating a small circle around herself for protection. The terror didn't disappear, but became manageable, like pain dulled by medication. She began to descend, moving carefully from rock to rock, using tree branches for support. The white trees seemed to watch her progress with alien intelligence, their branches swaying in patterns that had nothing to do with wind. Halfway down the slope, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood freeze. It was Aunt Millicent's voice, calling to her from somewhere in the grove. "Sarah, Sarah, don't come down here. It's a trap." Sarah forced herself to keep moving. It wasn't really Aunt Millicent. It was the entity, trying to trick her into stopping. But the voice was so convincing, so full of genuine fear and concern, that she had to fight her instincts to respond. "The grove isn't what you think it is," Millicent's voice continued. "It's not the entity's prison. It's its heart. If you disturb it, you'll make it stronger, not weaker." Sarah reached the bottom of the slope and stepped onto the grove's floor. The ground here was covered with a carpet of white flowers that gave off the same luminous glow as the trees. The air was thick with their perfume, sweet and intoxicating. As she walked deeper into the grove, Sarah began to understand why the entity had tried to stop her. This wasn't just a collection of trees. It was a living organism, a single entity that had grown and evolved over centuries. The white bark wasn't natural coloration. It was the entity's own substance, spread like a fungus through the wood. The grove was the entity's true body, and she was walking through its circulatory system. In the center of the grove, where the largest trees formed their natural circle, Sarah found what she was looking for. It was a pool of the same luminous white substance that covered the trees, but here it was liquid, bubbling and churning with life. This was the entity's heart, the source of its power. Sarah reached into her backpack and pulled out the iron nails and salt. If she could contaminate the heart with these protective substances, it might disrupt the entity's connection to the physical world. It was a theory based on fragmentary folklore, but it was the only plan she had. As she approached the pool, the entity's voice rang out across the grove, no longer disguised as someone else. "Stop." The voice was massive, coming from every tree simultaneously. "You don't understand what you're doing." Sarah knelt beside the pool and began pouring salt into the luminous liquid. The reaction was immediate and violent. The substance began to bubble and steam, releasing clouds of vapor that smelled like burned flowers. The trees around the grove began to shake, their branches whipping back and forth in fury. "You're destroying everything," the entity screamed. "This grove has stood for 1,000 years. It's part of the natural order." "Natural?" Sarah laughed bitterly as she began dropping iron nails into the pool. "There's nothing natural about feeding on human memories and emotions. You're a parasite, and it's time to remove you." The entity's response was to launch a final, desperate attack. Sarah felt its power slam into her mind like a battering ram, trying to overwhelm her with terror and despair. But she was protected by the iron and salt, and more importantly, by her own determination. She emptied her entire supply of salt into the pool, followed by every iron nail she brought. The white substance began to turn black, its luminous glow fading to a dull, sick light. The trees around the grove began to lose their unnatural coloration, their bark returning to normal brown. "Please," the entity whispered, its voice now small and weak. "Please, I'll leave you alone. I'll find another host. Just stop this." Sarah felt a moment of pity, but she forced herself to continue. She couldn't trust the entity's promises, and she couldn't live with the knowledge that it would simply find another victim. This ended here, today in this grove. The pool had turned completely black now, its surface still and lifeless. The trees around the grove were beginning to wither, their leaves falling like snow. The entity's screams echoed through the forest, growing weaker with each passing moment. Finally, there was silence. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. The grove was dying around her, the white trees returning to normal wood, the supernatural atmosphere dissipating like morning mist. She could feel the entity's presence fading, its connection to the physical world severed. But as she turned to leave, she realized she had a new problem. The psychological barriers that had protected the grove were gone, but so was her ability to find her way back. The compass spun wildly. The GPS showed no signal, and every direction looked the same. She was lost in the woods with no idea how to get home. Sarah wandered through the forest for hours, her initial elation at defeating the entity gradually giving way to a growing sense of panic. Without the supernatural influence distorting her senses, she should have been able to navigate normally, but the disruption of the grove seemed to have affected the entire area. Her compass spun like a roulette wheel, never settling on a consistent direction. The GPS device showed only static, and the sun was hidden behind an overcast sky that gave no indication of direction. Every tree looked the same. Every path led to another identical clearing, and her own footprints seemed to vanish as soon as she left them. By late afternoon, Sarah was forced to admit she was completely lost. She'd been walking in circles for hours, occasionally recognizing a fallen log or distinctive rock formation she'd passed before. Her water was running low, and she hadn't eaten since breakfast. She found a relatively sheltered spot beneath a large oak tree and sat down to rest. The forest was quiet around her, but it was a natural quiet now, the silence of a healthy ecosystem rather than the oppressive emptiness she'd grown accustomed to. Birds sang in the branches above her, and she could hear small animals moving through the underbrush. The entity was truly gone. She'd succeeded in destroying it, but at what cost? If she couldn't find her way back to the cabin, she might die of exposure before anyone found her. Emma wouldn't start looking for her until tomorrow at the earliest, and even then, she'd have no idea where to search. Sarah pulled out her phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. The battery was dead, despite being fully charged that morning. She wasn't sure if it was a lingering effect of the entity's influence or simply bad luck. As darkness began to fall, Sarah made a decision. She would spend the night here, rest, and try again in the morning. Maybe the dawn light would help her get her bearings. She had enough food and water to last until tomorrow, and her jacket was warm enough to protect her from the cool mountain air. She was gathering branches for a small fire when she heard the sound of a car engine in the distance. Sarah scrambled to her feet and ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or caution. The sound led her to a dirt road she didn't recognize, winding through the trees like a brown snake. A pickup truck was approaching, moving slowly as if the driver were looking for something. Sarah ran into the road, waving her arms frantically. The truck stopped, and she saw Emma's concerned face through the windshield. "Sarah, thank God." Emma jumped out of the truck and ran to her. "I've been looking for you for hours. I got your email and came straight here." "How did you find me?" Sarah asked, accepting Emma's embrace gratefully. "I know these woods better than anyone," Emma replied. "When I realized what you were trying to do, I drove to the most likely locations. The grove was my second guess." Emma helped Sarah into the truck, then drove in silence for several minutes. Finally, she spoke. "Did you find it?" "The grove." Sarah nodded. "It's gone. The entity is gone. I destroyed its heart, contaminated it with iron and salt." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "And how do you feel?" "Free," Sarah said immediately. "For the first time since I arrived here, I feel completely free. No watching eyes, no whispers, no sense of being hunted. It's over." Emma's expression was unreadable. "I'm glad you're safe," she said finally. "But Sarah, you need to understand something. The entity wasn't just a predator. It was also a guardian." "What do you mean?" "These mountains are old, Sarah, older than human civilization. There are things in the deep woods that make the entity look like a house cat. The entity fed on humans, yes, but it also kept other things at bay. It was the apex predator in a very dangerous ecosystem." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of things?" "I don't know exactly. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days before the entity came. She said the mountains were so dangerous that entire tribes would disappear overnight. The entity didn't just feed on memories, it also fed on the things that were feeding on humans. They drove in silence for a while, the headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Sarah tried to process what Emma had told her, but she was too exhausted to think clearly. She'd deal with the implications tomorrow. The cabin came into view, looking smaller and more ordinary than she remembered. Without the entity's influence, it was just a house. Old, well-built, but fundamentally normal. Sarah felt a surge of affection for the place. It was hers now, truly hers, free from supernatural interference. Emma helped her inside and made her a cup of tea while Sarah changed into dry clothes. The cabin felt different, lighter, warmer, more welcoming. The shadows were just shadows. The creaking was just the sound of settling wood. And the portrait above the fireplace was just a painting of a dead woman. "I should get going," Emma said as Sarah settled into the living room chair. "You need rest, and I have a long drive ahead of me." "Emma, wait." Sarah caught her friend's arm. "Thank you for everything, for helping me understand what I was dealing with, for being my friend when I needed one, for coming to find me today." Emma smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're welcome, Sarah. I just hope you made the right choice." After Emma left, Sarah sat in the quiet cabin and tried to process everything that had happened. She'd achieved her goal. The entity was gone, and she was free. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made a terrible mistake. Emma's words echoed in her mind. It was also a guardian. What if the entity had been serving a purpose beyond simple predation? What if its presence had been keeping something even worse at bay? Sarah pushed the thoughts away. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and in no condition to make rational decisions. She would sleep, and in the morning, she would figure out what to do next. She checked all the doors and windows before bed, not out of fear, but out of habit. The cabin was secure, the night was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt truly safe. But as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard something in the distance, a sound like howling, but deeper and more primal than any wolf. It was probably just the wind, she told herself. Just the normal sounds of a mountain forest at night. She was almost asleep when she heard the scratching. It came from the basement, a soft, rhythmic sound like claws on stone. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The entity was gone. She'd felt it die, had watched its grove wither and collapse. This had to be something else. The scratching continued, growing more insistent. Sarah got out of bed and crept to the basement door. The sound was definitely coming from below, accompanied now by what sounded like whispers in a language she didn't recognize. Sarah opened the door and peered down into the darkness. The basement was black as pitch, but she could see faint movements in the shadows. Something was down there, something that had been waiting for the entity to die. She slammed the door shut and turned the deadbolt, backing away slowly. The scratching stopped, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more urgent. Sarah spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, every light in the house blazing. The whispers eventually faded, but they didn't disappear entirely. She could still hear them at the edge of perception, like a radio station barely tuned in. By morning, the sounds had stopped completely. Sarah checked the basement cautiously, but it was empty except for Aunt Millicent's symbols and the books she'd left. So what would you do? Would you stay awake forever, listening to your own voice begging from inside the walls? Or would you eventually give in to sleep, not knowing if you'd ever wake up again? Let me know in the comments below what you think is really happening. And if you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale, smash that like button and subscribe for more horror stories that will keep you up at night. Sweet dreams, if you can manage to have any. Until next time, keep the lights on.